Welcome back to the Halls of History, everyone. I hope you enjoyed my three-part series of my conversation with Anthony Jaworski, a friend of over 20 years and a shareholder of the Green Bay Packers. But on to this week's episode. I am sticking with the Packers, and if you remember my trivia question from the end of part 3 of my chat with Anthony, who was the very first player to rush for over 1,000 yards in a season in Packers history? The answer? Pro Football Hall of Famer Tony Canadeo, aka the Gray Ghost of Gonzaga. I'll get to how he got his incredible nickname a little later. Canadeo played for the Packers from 1941 through 1952, and he did a little bit, or a lot in some cases, of everything. Not only did he run, but he passed, caught passes, returned punts and kickoffs, punted, and played in the defensive backfield. Remember, a lot of players during this era played both sides of the ball. Unlimited substitutions and an increase in the number of players that teams could have on their roster didn't come until 1950. Now, there was some use of this rule during World War II, but that was due to many players being gone from teams because of military duty. Back to today's main figure. Anthony Canadeo, or Big Tone as Tony's father was known, was born in Italy in the coastal town of Brindisi, which is in the heel of the boot of Italy and along the eastern coast. He came to America in 1910 and married Catherine Marinello in 1915. Tony, or Little Tone, was the second of 5 children and born in 1919 in Chicago. He grew up a fan of the Chicago Bears and the Cubs. Tony watched and followed great Bears runners like Red Grange, the Galloping Ghost, Bronco Nagurski, who was his favorite player, and B.D. Feathers, the man who became the very first player in NFL history to rush for 1,000 yards in a single season with 1,004 in 1934. I'll get to more with Feathers later. Tony starred for Steinmetz High School. He was one of the more popular players and was known to be very competitive, but also lighthearted and a great teammate. Tony helped lead Steinmetz to a championship in his senior year in 1936. Now a high school graduate in the summer of 1937, Tony still didn't think seriously about going to college and actually went to work in Green Bay. While there, he met Ivan Tiny Cahoon, who coached football at a local high school. Tiny had played at Gonzaga and was still in touch with former teammate and now head coach Mike Pekarovich. Tiny convinced Tony to give Gonzaga a try and gave a glowing recommendation to Coach Pekarovich. Tony went west and became a star for the Bulldogs, doing a bit of everything, most famously for running the football. During his time on the West Coast, Tony received many accolades, including being named a Little All-America selection. He also made a big impression on a very famous Gonzaga alum, Bing Crosby, recording and Hollywood star, who came back to Spokane several times, especially while Tony was running wild on the field. Tony was given the nickname the Spokane Spook because, as one newspaper reporter put it, quote, "He ran with a ghostly gallop. He was hard to tackle. He had a ghost-like appearance to the visiting team because they couldn't get their arms around him." But during his time in college, Tony's hair began to turn gray. And so after a while, Spook became Ghost, and then Gray was later added. But the full nickname of the Gray Ghost of Gonzaga didn't come into full effect until he was a pro. By the end of his senior season in 1940, there were some professional football teams that were reaching out to Tony to try and gauge his interest in continuing playing. Remember, this was well before the times of massive contracts and every college player's goal of moving on to the NFL. I know that sounds crazy to us now, but teams had to make sure back then that somebody was actually going to want to keep playing. So, with the talks from teams, Tony Canadeo thought that Washington would end up selecting him. But Washington thought that he was obscure enough that they wouldn't need to waste a draft pick on him and could pick him up as a rookie free agent. However, the Green Bay Packers swooped in and selected the Gray Ghost in the 9th round, pick number 77 of the 1941 NFL Draft. That year, there were 22 rounds with 204 picks total. There were just 10 teams in the NFL at this time. Well, Washington wasn't happy, but clearly they had a chance to get him before. There were some other big names taken in 1941. Tom Harmon, Vic Sears, Norm Stanley, and Paul Chrisman, to name a few. But to this day, Tony Canadeo remains the only one who resides in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. When Tony got to the Packers, he wanted to continue to wear number 13, which he had at Gonzaga. However, Green Bay didn't have a 13 jersey, so instead he got number 3. And the last Packer to wear number 3 before Tony was B.D. Feathers in 1940. Remember the first player to rush for over 1,000 yards while with the Bears back in 1934. He played sparingly in just 1 year for Green Bay. Now, as I go through some of Tony's career numbers, a lot of it is not going to sound as flashy or as great as many other players, Hall of Fame or not. The thing to remember about the era that we're dealing with here in the 1940s, players were on the field for offense and defense, and most likely special teams as well. Franchises also had a full stable of running backs, since this was before the passing game really took off. It was very common for teams to have 3 or more players gaining over 300 yards rushing in a season. The Packers at the time did have Don Hutson, which you can catch a previous video that I did talking about his incredible career exploits as a receiver. But this was still a run-heavy time. Plus the league schedule was just 11 and then 12 games during the 40s. No 16 or 17 game schedule like what we are used to today. As a rookie in 1941, Tony rushed for 137 yards, which ranked 4th on the team. Eventual Hall of Famer Clark Hinkle in his final season led with 393. Cecil Isbell, who was the main passer, even though his position was listed as tailback, was second with 317. So you kind of see how this is going to go here. In 1943, as World War II was kicking into high gear for the United States, Tony rushed for a then career best and team-leading 489 yards and averaged over 5 yards a carry. He was also the Packers' leading passer with 56 completions for 875 yards and 9 touchdowns. Again, a different time. He caught 2 TD passes, averaged over 11 yards per punt return, over 24 yards per kick return, and intercepted 2 passes on defense. He was named an All-Pro. In 1944, Tony was drafted again, this time by the U.S. Army, and was sent to Europe. It looked like he was going to miss the entire season, but Tony was allowed to go home on furlough in October for the birth of his first child with his wife Ruth, and they had just been married during the 1943 season. While he was home, Tony talked to head coach Curly Lambeau and was able to suit back up for the Packers. He had a big game against the Rams, gaining over 100 yards on just 12 carries, and was able to stick around for 3 games before having to go back to active duty. The Packers won the NFL title that season, which ended up being the last of the glory days for over a decade. Tony was unfortunately not there to play in the 14-7 championship win over the Giants. The Gray Ghost returned to the Packers after the war was over, but not until the 1946 season. So now Tony had pretty much missed 2 years. It took him a little time to get back into football shape, but he still ended up leading the team in rushing yards for the second time in his career with 476. As the 40s were coming to a close, the passing game for the Packers just completely deteriorated. Hudson had retired, and Curly Lambeau kept trying to stick with an old formation, and it just wasn't working anymore. Defenses began keying in on the running game, but Tony kept right on plowing through. In 1947, and now with a 12-game schedule, he led the team again with 464 yards. During that same year, Philadelphia Eagles star back Steve Van Buren became the second player in NFL history to reach the 1,000-yard plateau, gaining a league record 1,008. In 1948, Tony totaled another career best with 589 yards. However, 1949 was to be a banner year for Tony Canadeo, despite the Packers continuing to drop down in the league standings. Now, the year before, in 1948, Green Bay finished 3-9 and in 4th place out of 5 teams in the West. 1949, the Packers finished 2-10 and in dead last. But the Gray Ghost galloped his way through the defenses that were solely focused on trying to stop him. In the first game of the season, a 17-0 loss to the Bears, Tony rushed for 92 yards on 11 carries. Then he was held in check a bit the following week against the Rams with 43 yards on 12 runs. But after that game, 100 yards in a victory against the New York Bulldogs, 75 versus the Cardinals, 122 in a rematch with the Rams, but still a loss. 117 in a win over Detroit, unfortunately the last win of the year. 95 yards against the Bears, 71 versus the Giants, 116 over Pittsburgh, and then 122 at the Cardinals. Tony was sitting at 953 yards with 2 games remaining. Unfortunately, in a 30-0 blowout in Washington, Tony managed just 29 yards. But he reached the incredible milestone in the final game of the year with 70 yards in a loss at Detroit. Tony Canadeo became just the third player in NFL history and the first in Packers lore to rush for over 1,000 yards in a season, finishing with 1,052. He averaged 5.1 yards per carry against defenses that knew the key to stopping the Green Bay offense was to stop the Gray Ghost. Now, the next Packer to run for 1,000? Jim Taylor in 1960. And just to give you some other numbers to help you realize just how incredible this feat was for Tony. Remember, this was a 12-game season. He averaged just under 88 yards a game, which by today's 17-game league slate would get him to 1,491. The passing game for Green Bay was beyond anemic. Split between mainly Jug Girard and Stan Heath, but also Jack Jacobs doing some passing, the Green Bay Packers completed only 91 passes on 299 attempts, just 30.4% completion rate. The three combined for 1,291 yards. That's an average of just 107.6 yards per game. And they tossed 5 touchdowns compared to 29 interceptions. Only 3 players that season caught more than 10 passes, with Ted Cook leading the way with 25 catches for 442 yards and 1 score. Now, could you imagine in this era of passing, if a team put up those kind of numbers? The anger that would come from fans, and especially fantasy fans, would be off the charts. Social media and all of the sports media out there would have a field day. Coaches would get fired, players most likely released, and probably even a general manager losing their job. Tony accounted for more than half of Green Bay's rushing offense. If you completely take away Tony's numbers, the remaining Packers ran for 1,009 yards on 295 carries, averaging only 3.4 yards per rush. With all of that, just think about it again. What Tony Canadeo did in 1949 and just how incredible of an accomplishment that was. It didn't happen in the glory years of the Packers. This was at one of the lowest points in the franchise's history. And changes were coming for Green Bay. Curly Lambeau, the only coach the team had known, resigned after 1949. And Gene Ronzani took over. There also came a position change for the team's only star as Tony was moved from halfback to fullback, Ronzani deciding that he wanted more speed. Despite putting up such amazing numbers the year before, the Gray Ghost saw his number of carries plummet and his average yards per carry down as well, as he mainly was now used for short yardage and goal line situations along with blocking. Over the next 3 seasons, Tony ran for just 569 yards, averaging only 2.7 yards per carry. When Tony Canadeo decided that 1952 was going to be his final season, he received an amazing send-off in his final home game, which ended up being a 42-14 win over the Dallas Texans. And Tony scored twice in that win. In his last year, he also managed to finally do something that had eluded him throughout his whole career: win a game against the Bears at Wrigley Field in Chicago. And remember, Tony grew up in Chicago watching the Bears at Wrigley. This was before Soldier Field. And every year the Packers just could not defeat the monsters of the Midway in Tony's hometown. But finally, on November 9th, 1952, Green Bay won 41-28 in Wrigley. Tony ran for 61 yards, his best output of the season. His teammates were so happy for him, as Tony always poured out everything he had against the Bears, especially when they played in Chicago. They gave him the game ball, and that definitely held a nice little place of honor in Tony's home for the remainder of his life. Tony Canadeo walked away from the gridiron having played 116 games. He was now the Packers' all-time leading rusher, with 4,197 yards and scored 26 touchdowns. The other numbers for the all-everything star: 69 catches for 579 yards and 5 scores, 105 pass completions for 1,642 yards and 20 TDs, 46 punt returns for 513 yards at over 11 yards per return, 75 kickoff returns for 1,736 yards and an average of over 23 yards per return, 45 punts and a 37.1 yard average, and 9 interceptions on defense for 129 yards. He tallied 31 total touchdowns, as well as 4,776 total yards of offense and 7,154 all-purpose yards. He's also one of just 6 players in franchise history to have his number retired. The others? Don Hutson's number 14 in 1951. Bart Starr's number 15 in 1973, Ray Nitschke's number 66 in 1983, Reggie White's number 92 in 2005, and finally Brett Favre's number 4 in 2015. So many greats in Green Bay's past, and no one has worn the number 3 since 1952. Tony was also the only one to have his number retired immediately upon his retirement. If that doesn't tell you what he meant to the franchise, well. Tony Canadeo went on to become a member of the Green Bay Packers Board of Directors from 1955 to 1993, as well as being on the Packers Executive Committee beginning in 1958 all the way to 1993. During that time, Tony was instrumental in the hiring of Vince Lombardi and the return to the glory years throughout the 1960s. Tony and Vince became very close friends. It's one of the few people that Vince allowed into his inner circle. The Gray Ghost of Gonzaga had quite the impact on the field, but it was more than just his running the football that made people and his teammates love him. He was a team-first kind of guy, never complained, knew how and when to crack a joke to keep everyone's spirits up. And another big important was he began to take the rookies under his wing and help teach them the way to be a professional and a Green Bay Packer. In 1973, Tony was inducted into the Green Bay Packer Hall of Fame and the Wisconsin Athletic Hall of Fame. The following year, Tony Canadeo was inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame. His fellow class members, all directly up above me, Bill George, a monster of the Midway for the Bears, who entered the league in 1952, Tony's final season, Lou the Toe Groza, and Dick Night Train Lane. Now, a quick look at the 1,000-yard club from back in those days. So B.D. Feathers was the first to do it with 1,004 as a rookie in 1934. He averaged 91.3 yards a game over the 11-game season. That would be over 1,550 yards by today's schedule, and averaged an astounding 8.4 yards per carry, which is still the league record, and it was only been tied so far just by Michael Vick in 2006. Feathers never again reached those heights. He rushed for just 976 yards over the next 6 years. Steve Van Buren was next in 1947, breaking Feathers' record with 1,008 over 12 games. He averaged 84 yards a game and 4.6 per carry and scored 13 touchdowns. Van Buren missed a game in 1948 and finished with 945 yards before hitting the 1,000-yard milestone again in 1949, the same year as Canadeo, with a league-leading 1,146. However, Van Buren had 55 more carries than Tony and averaged 4.4 per run. Plus, Philly went 11-1 that year and won the NFL title. Quarterback Tommy Thompson had better passing numbers by himself that year than all of the Packers. 1949 was also the last time that Van Buren hit the milestone, rushing for 956 yards combined over the next 2 years. And when he retired, he was the NFL's all-time leading rusher with 5,860. Tony finished in second place at the time of his retirement. Now, with looking back through other professional leagues that merged with the NFL, and those numbers beginning to be recognized, there was actually another player who reached 1,000 yards before Tony, doing it in 1947, the same year as Van Buren. Spec Sanders, playing for the New York Yankees of the All-America Football Conference. Yes, the New York Yankees. Sanders went off in 1947 with 1,432 yards, but it was a 14-game schedule in the AAFC. However, that is still averaging 102.3 yards per game, over 1,730 today, and 6.2 per carry. Sanders had an explosive few years in the AAFC with the Yankees. In 1950, when the leagues merged, the New York Yankees were dissolved, and Sanders spent one season with the New York Yanks, who used to be the New York Bulldogs. And Sanders was actually not used as a running back, despite putting up those incredibly gaudy numbers, and was instead a safety. He went to the Pro Bowl in 1950, leading the league with 13 interceptions. He decided to retire after the 1950 season. In doing research for this week's show, I found and read a great book called In Search of a Hero by David Zimmerman, who was a big fan of the Packers, and Tony Canadeo was his favorite player. Now, this book was published in 2001, just 2 years before Tony passed away at the age of 84. And David Zimmerman was definitely able to talk to Tony Canadeo for this book. It is a great read. And in fact, I have a couple of fun stories here for you about the Gray Ghost, just to give you a little taste. Let me find the first one. From 1948, when the season was just beginning to unravel for Green Bay. The team was in Pittsburgh, and former teammate and lineman Damon Tassos recalled the story. When we played the Steelers in Pittsburgh, Tony was there with a bad cold, trying to play on a slippery field, and the crowd was giving him a bad time. Shocker, right? Opposing team, crowd giving you a bad time out there on the field, especially for the star player. They booed and razzed him, and he kept trying and trying. One time we ran the sweep, and he came around the corner and ran for about 30 or 40 yards and scored. He stopped in the end zone, raised the ball up, and gave the crowd the finger. He wanted to make sure that everybody got the finger. We got that on game film and got a good laugh watching it later in the week. I mean, could you imagine that happening now? I mean, obviously, of course, anytime somebody tries to give somebody the finger, they capture it on camera somewhere. But he was trying to give it to the entire crowd. Now, the second story comes from Dick Wildung, another lineman that cleared the way for Tony. And he remembered just how tough Tony was on the field. He said, "We had a back from Purdue named Ed Cody. He was with us for a couple of years, and then they cut him, and the Bears picked him up. We were playing the Bears in Chicago, and George Halas had Cody playing a blitzing linebacker. He never played defense at Green Bay, but the Bears had him playing linebacker and would have him blitz the quarterback. That's about the time that blitzing really started. So Cody was getting quite a bit of publicity over blitzing passers, and that day he was killing our quarterbacks. Later in the game, Tony waited for Cody and caught him with an elbow and put him cuckoo." That is the quote, "put him cuckoo." Out like a light. He didn't blitz anymore that day. A different time. This was a great book, and if you are interested in learning even more about Tony Canadeo, I do suggest reading this. Again, it's called In Search of a Hero, and it was by David Zimmerman, and I did find that on Amazon. Over the years, people always talked about how gracious Tony was, and of course, they always went back to just how much fun it was to watch him run. Okay, there you go, folks. The story of Tony Canadeo, the gray ghost of Gonzaga, and the first player to rush for over 1,000 yards in Green Bay Packers history. One of the greats who kind of gets a little bit forgotten, unfortunately, as history has rolled along, but great player nonetheless. Up next, I'm going to stick with 1,000-yard rushers. Your trivia question to get you set for next week's episode. Here we go. Who were the first pair of teammates to rush for 1,000 yards in the same season? Couple of hints. It happened during a perfect season, and one of the two is in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. Think you know? Drop your guesses in the comments below, and don't forget to click subscribe and click the notification button to always know what is next on the Halls of History.